lecture of the series in stress physiology is about the general adaptation syndrome. And I think it's very important to put science in the context on the people that actually have been responsible for that. Although we are not going to look into the history of physiology, it's important to see that our understanding of the general adaptation syndrome, or actually the same name of the general adaptation syndrome, comes from a researcher that started working in the 1930s and basically came up with most of the fundamental concepts on the stress response. And this is Hans Selye, a Hungarian-born scientist that worked in Canada for his entire basic life. What Hans Selye realized is that the body response to unpleasant situations is not specific. What he realized is that animals respond to different situations that are unpleasant with the same response. For example, he was an endocrinologist. He was interested in understanding the effect of different hormones, but at that time, they did not know, they did not have the means to isolate these substances. How were they working? In a very simple way. They took organs from animals, mashed them up, made them into some mush, and then used this mush to inject it in the animals and see basically if this did something. At that time, they did not have purified hormones. Remember that the first hormone secretin was discovered in the 1920s by Ernst Starling, or 1930s. So we are talking about the very, very beginnings of endocrinology. And what he was interested is about these ovarian extracts from the ovaries that actually he injected in rats. And what he realized is that if he injected these ovarian extracts in rats, there were some clear pathological effects. The animals, the rats, developed peptic ulcers, ulcers in the stomach and the intestine. They actually developed adrenal hypertrophy, enlarging of the adrenal glands. And they actually showed a regression of immune organs. Immune organs such as the spleen and the thymus, they became smaller. So then he thought, okay, there is something in this ovarian extract that actually causes these effects. But Hans Selye was no fool. And he was well aware of the scientific method. What he was doing is actually injecting, in this case, ovarian extracts into rats. And he actually put the proper question, is the injection that does that? And then what do? Instead of injecting ovarian extracts, you inject salt water. Saline-injected rats develop the same symptoms. Hold on. If saline-injected rats develop the same, it has nothing to do with the ovarian extract. It's actually with the manipulation proceeding itself. And that is the start observation saying, well, in this case, you are subjecting these rats to an unpleasant situation, the fact that you have to handle them. And this was not a one single time injection. They were injected daily. So of course, this was a recurrent situation. It was the unpleasantness of daily injections, he concluded, not the ovarian extract in itself, that actually was causing all these effects. He also realized that similar effects could be triggered by other treatments. If he exposed these rats to cold, to spinal injuries, to excessive exercise, or to intoxication with sublethal doses of drugs. So anything that seemed to be unpleasant caused very similar effects, and that's what he called the general adaptation syndrome. He understood that these unpleasant situations, the animal reacted to these unpleasant situations with a common pattern, and this common pattern involved peptic ulcers, adrenal hypertrophy, immune regression. Hans Selye referred to this process of coping with stressors as the general adaptation syndrome, the GAS. Nowadays, of course, we know that the general adaptation syndrome is mediated by the activation of two things, the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis. What's important is that this is not unique to rats. All vertebrates that we know of actually show a similar conserved stress response. So the existence of a sympathetic response and an HPA axis response through glucocorticoids seems to be a conserved response, at least in vertebrates. How Hans Selye saw this stress, or this response to the stress response, he basically explained it in this time graph. As time goes by, what is the animal experiencing and how is the animal reacting? And he explains that in the beginning, in this yellow part, you have the exposure to a stressful situation, to an unpleasant situation, causes in the animal a situation of alarm. This is what we call nowadays the acute stress response. So the animal starts putting together the mechanisms to handle this. As time goes by, it goes into a phase of resistance. It's basically the animal is adjusting to it and reaching the maximum response that it can provide for that. And what he also saw and what he also described is by the end, there is an exhaustion phase. The exhaustion phase means that the animal is not able to cope with it, and this can result in disease or death. So in the exhaustion case, as Selye saw it, there was a depletion of energy stores, fatigue of the myocardium, damaged blood vessels, infection was prevalent, and wounds would not heal. The animal basically died because it could not actually no longer cope with this situation. This is a sort of a summary picture of it, in which you have the HPA axis and the adrenergic neurohormonal system. Through the sympathetic nervous system, secretion from the adrenal medulla of adrenaline that targets other organs. And at the level of the cortex, the HPA axis is responsible for the secretion of the glucocorticoids, cortisol, and corticosteroid. This would be a summary picture of what are the physiological mechanisms of stress. But notice that what this picture is missing totally is the time component into it. This tells you when they are activated, this happens. But for how long do you have these responses? And what are the consequences of a long-term exposure to stress? In other words, going back to Hans Selye, basically, yeah, we understand the activation part here. But what's going on later on that makes that eventually the animals may adjust to it, or at the end may not be able to cope at all with it. And here we have the mechanisms that are recruited during acute stress that we are going to discuss in more detail. I decided to divide them in 4 different parts. First of all, you have fast effects. Fast effects most likely targeting the cardiorespiratory system. And these are purely driven by the sympathetic nervous system, as we'll see. Then you have metabolic effects that, of course, will be a combination of the sympathetic nervous system and glucocorticoids. You also have sensory and cognitive effects that we will talk very little about, because although we have a lot of data, the data is rather confusing. It's not matching between species. And here we have not only the glucocorticoids, but also the endogenous opioids, the beta endorphins that are released together with ACTH. And finally, I think that it's important to emphasize that there is a downplaying function in organs that are less crucial. Because ultimately what the stress response is a priorization. The body decides this is important, I deal with it. This is not important, I leave it aside. And I think that basically the way we should see it is that by eliminating some elements in these responses, things that are not important for the body at the time, we are presumably focusing the energy we have into what is actually important. So, fast cardiorespiratory effects to start with. The sympathetic nervous system is the first in place. This is a nerve response. It does not require the release of substances from the hypothalamus into the pituitary, from the pituitary into the blood, from the blood targeting the adrenal cortex. That takes time. We usually say, those that do research on this system, when we are interested in measuring glucocorticoid levels in the blood, we usually say that we have a window of 2 to 3 minutes before glucocorticoids increase. That means that it takes the animal 2 to 3 minutes to elevate the concentration of glucocorticoids in the blood. However, we have much less time when it comes to the sympathetic nervous system. And that's something that you can relate to what you know. Adrenaline kicks in very quickly. This is a nerve response. For adrenaline, released from the adrenal medulla, all that it needs is activation of the sympathetic nerve fiber that actually reaches the adrenal medulla. And then you have release of adrenaline. So that's why this is a fast response. And it's important because you want to supply crucial organs such as the heart, the muscles, and the lungs. Those are the organs that have to react fastest. You have first an increased cardiac output. This increased cardiac output is mediated by beta-adrenergic receptors. You have an increased minute ventilation, an increased respiration rate. You also at the same time have a preferential blood supply to the muscles and to the heart at the expense of other organs such as the gut and the skin. So in other words, this increased cardiac output, you are sending the blood where the blood is needed. Where do you need the blood? To the heart, to the coronary circulation. The coronaries are the blood vessels that surround the heart. And then you also supply this to the muscles, but not to the rest of the body, not to the gut, not to the skin. How do you do that? The difference is, again, at the level of the adrenergic receptors. The adrenergic receptors in the gut and the skin are alpha-adrenergic receptors that cause constriction. The adrenergic receptors present in the coronary circulation and into the muscle circulation are beta-adrenergic receptors. When they see an increase in adrenaline, when they reach this sympathetic activation, they dilate. So you have dilation of the blood vessels in the heart and the muscles, constriction of the blood vessels in the gut and the skin. And then you are preferentially perfusing, sending blood to those organs that are important. That's what is shown here. And finally, you also have bronchial dilatation, which is mediated by beta-adrenergic receptors. So the dilatation of the bronchi in terms of facilitating increasing respiratory output. Metabolic effects. First of all, adrenaline facilitates the breakdown of muscle glycogen. Glycogen is actually a polysaccharide. Glycogen consists of many molecules of glucose that are basically chained together, polymerized. As such, the body cannot use it. The body uses glycogen in terms of storing glucose. At the time of need, this glycogen can be broken down in its component units, glucose, and released into the bloodstream or made available to the same muscle. Glucocorticoids complement this response by mobilizing glucose at the expense of fat and proteins. So what is happening here is that there is a stimulation of gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is a process by which amino acids are shuffled into the sugar metabolism. You can, some amino acids, not all amino acids can be converted into glucose, but those that can, basically breaking down muscle protein and then making glucose out of them, and that's what's called gluconeogenesis. Glucocorticoids also decrease glucose utilization. It has an anti-insulin effect. Glucocorticoids cause this protein mobilization from the muscle, which means basically a decrease in lean body mass. A decrease in lean body mass because muscle protein are being broken down. And finally, glucocorticoids trigger lipolysis, breakdown of fats, again, for the same, with the same aim at releasing energy. The sensory and cognitive effects, you have the suppression of pain that we have mentioned several times via endogenous opioids derived from POMC, specifically the beta endorphins. And then we know also, but this is a more complex area, that actually some areas of the central nervous system in the brain have receptors for CRH. What that means is that basically the stress response that we are now seeing, which is mostly peripheral, we are saying, yes, as glucocorticoids are released, metabolic mobilization, sympathetic nervous system, the cardiorespiratory system, but at the same time, there is a stress response in the brain that can be mediated by CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, at the level of the brain. For example, known in the amygdala, where there is an association with increased anxiety as a response to the stress response. Unlike catecholamines, and this is an important detail, glucocorticoids can cross the blood-brain barrier. So we know that there are glucocorticoid receptors in different areas of the brain. The problem is that their roles are not unequivocally characterized. We know much less about this, and we are not going to be talking about this. But the message I want to leave with you is that, of course, the stress response is having an effect on the brain itself. And that is possible because glucocorticoids can cross the blood-brain barrier. Finally, inhibitory action on non-crucial systems. We know that noradrenaline, as I said, vasoconstricts non-priority organs, such as the gut and the skin. That's a way to say, hey, this is out of the equation. You may have heard that the gastrointestinal tract is a very expensive organ. The gastrointestinal tract, for processing the food and nutrients, is an organ that usually accounts for 20 to 30% of the basal metabolic rate. That means about a third of the basal metabolism is needed to keep the gastrointestinal tract going. If you can avoid that, you are doing a saving. We also know that glucocorticoids are powerful anti-inflammatory molecules. They have an effect on the immune system. We also know that glucocorticoids temporarily suppress reproduction. Again, notice that we are going always to the same pattern. Organs that we see as less critical, the reproductive system, well, you know, in a situation of emergency, you can go by without bothering about the reproductive tract. You'll bother about that if you survive. But if you don't survive, perhaps there is no point. So, in a nutshell, because this is just the summary of everything. Increase energy, decrease pain. And what we will see later is basically how these things can go wrong. But the message that you have to see is that the stress response is an adaptive response. An adaptive response triggered to increase survival. By shifting non-essential and energetically expensive processes to those processes that matter. What we want is to, for the time being, focus on survival, focus on what matters, and then the rest we leave it on the side. And then I found this because, as a consequence here, we can always be left with, well, is it so good, is it so smart to actually have immunosuppression, to suppress the function of the immune system? Okay, perhaps all the other things, I guess that I would buy myself, but I'm not so convinced that, I would say that the immune function is not important. But we know, as a matter of fact, that glucocorticoids suppress immune function. So this is a paper that actually discusses this. The adaptive significance of a stress-induced immunosuppression. It's actually a paper from Lund University. And these authors, I encourage you to read through this, but these authors provide two scenarios for which actually glucocorticoids impair immune function. They say, as one could start perhaps saying, well, the immune system is it's an energetically expensive system. Therefore, by saving on the energy that costs for the immune function, we gain. But it's unclear, as the authors write here. First, several authors have suggested that the immune system is suppressed to reallocate resources to other metabolic demands. In our view, this hypothesis assumes that considerable amounts of energy or nutrients can be saved by suppressing the immune system. However, this assumption requires further investigation. What they are saying is, yeah, this is a guess, but we have no data to support that. These authors actually provide an alternative scenario. And what they are actually saying, I'm not sure I buy it totally, what they are proposing is that in a situation of emergency, the last thing you want is that a system like the immune system that is based on many different actors and many different cell types working everywhere goes haywire. What they are suggesting is that immune suppression is important because if the immune system is not suppressed in a case of emergency, the consequences of the immune system working haywire here and there could be worse than if it does not work at all. And I think that that's an interesting hypothesis. They have not proven it, they don't prove it, they just discuss this as a potential thing. But they suggest that we hypothesize that the risk of autoimmune responses increases during heavy physical workload, which could be a form of stress, and that the immune system is suppressed to counteract this. They are saying that in the case of stress, you don't want the immune system to be activated because then you may trigger autoimmune responses against your own body. And then that would be even worse than actually suppressing the system. This is a hypothesis, but I think it's an interesting hypothesis that actually confronts the other, the energetically saving hypothesis as another alternative. So with this, I just wanted to wrap around the concept of going back to Hans Selye, his general adaptation syndrome. Hans Selye knew very little about molecules that were involved, but he could guess from the beginning that these animals are all trying to do the same, are trying to survive. He could recognize the role of this stress response in terms of saving, in terms of prioritizing some organs versus others. And he recognized that, of course, this was a constant, or this was a conserved response for all vertebrates. Hans Selye continued working in this for many, many years. I think he died in the late 80s. And of course, a lot of the contributions that were made into this area were made by him. But he was the first one to recognize it. And that should be the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for listening.